At 1 a.m., or exactly merely just 1 hour into the overall nationwide invasion, and included in that the battle going on in the Houston metro area, including the core metro area within a 15 by 15 mile area north, south, east, west, as the defenses in this area had been relatively well put together, at least from a logistical standpoint and an overall strategy standpoint, as the strategy for the defense of the city hinged upon a few different factors. One factor being that the ISR and communications network continue to function, and the other factor being that the forces, as a result of such, be able to mutually support one another as they were spread relatively thin and were comprised of the different forces in terms of their potential in combat, and the logistical factor related to all of it corresponded to the network of transportation and the bivouac sites that were able to be selected and leased. And although the PLA had correctly ascertained through their cyber arm, which was massive and extremely well funded, and their hacking activities, discovering the financial transaction records, which led them to pinpoint the exact bivouac sites as per the lease agreements with the property owners involved in the leasing thereof, these forces were able to tailor all of this into their original war planning, and also as it related to their own ancillary objectives that didn't involve immediately destroying the American forces where they stood, as in other objectives that related specifically to their post-victory colonization efforts. And many, though, of the objectives that were being defended by the Americans, in fact, were places that figured into the additional objectives that went beyond just destroying the enemy forces. And although within the first hour, the first major fighting that had begun at 12:15 and ended at 1 was the destruction of the nucleus, or the nerve center, of the city's defenses and logistical effort, as the forward deployed logistical centers that were staffed by the headquarters of headquarters troop of the entire 278th ACR, as well as also the support squadron of the 278th ACR that was stationed in the Galena Park area and was conveniently able to utilize previously shuttered riverine port facilities on the Buffalo Bayou that had been closed in the early 2000s due to security reasoning given, and were thus able to utilize the riverine port facilities to import logistics through the riverine port, as the supplies could come up the Galveston Bay and into the Buffalo Bayou and sail upstream to support and supply these forces and build up supplies, as well as also being driven on the roadways from Ellington to likewise add additional supplies to that facility, as they would be flown into Ellington and then trucked to their locations where they would be stockpiled before being distributed to the local combat units in the area, as it related to the different forward logistical centers in the city that would receive logistics from Ellington and also from the Navy as it pertained to those sailed in. These logistics were critically important for the operations of the city's defenders, as they relied upon the supplies getting where they needed to go when they needed to get there. As for the transportation network, which also figured highly into the movement of the very heaviest of the forces, such as the rail network, which had a number of facilities along it where the corporate-owned rail platforms that could support heavy military vehicles were utilized to detrain these military units, including in the Sugarland railheads that belonged to the different factories that were located within the chief industrial zone in that city, which were utilized not only to detrain the two different artillery assets that were in this core metro area, being the 2nd of the 114th, as well as the Regimental Fire Squadron of the 278th ACR, itself a battalion-sized artillery force, which were combined in this area, and now at one being attacked by the two armored battalions of the very same 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade that the mechanized infantry battalions thereof would attack the 2nd Squadron at the same time at 1 a.m., who themselves, as it pertained to 2nd Squadron, were defending an area that not only encompassed the Houston Southwest Airport, which was captured by the PLA Combat Engineer Battalion of the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade without a fight at all, but the two different mechanized infantry battalions moving into the area from their CCP regime properties as they materialized in this area, along with the combat engineers, had engaged very briefly very scant, tiny groups of reactionary armed civilians that had held them up as their objective. The 2nd Squadron was only merely several miles away from their muster and assembly points on their CCP regime properties and fighting these very tiny bands of armed reactionary civilians. Hence, they're not located as icon markers due to their numbers being smaller than 100 each, as these numbered over 200 each and would materialize after the defeat of the 2nd Squadron, whereby these two different battalions would begin to clear the flanks of them as well, as their number would rise and fall as the campaign progressed, as it related to the reactionary elements that were being encountered throughout the metro area. As the other forces were in various stages of combat and attaining victory over their foes, as the battles even began at different times within or at hour number 1. The battle against 2nd Squadron was no exception, and the two different battalions attacking, upon having successfully eliminated their very small foes in terms of the groupings of reactionary armed civilians that had risen up from their homes in most cases and had fought these forces as they passed through the area, proving a threat and thus being eliminated swiftly and harshly by the PLA forces, as generally they ignored civilians, unlike the People's Armed Police, who savagely reveled in annihilating them, armed or unarmed. But the PLA generally tried to adhere to the Geneva Conventions, even though they frequently bent them at times. And after crushing these forces, had advanced from the south and from the west towards the east, and attacking this particular battalion or 2nd Squadron. In CAV terms, a squadron is a battalion. As this battalion and this battalion of mechanized infantry were each made up of 3 mechanized infantry companies, a single company of fire support forces as a fire support company, and also a headquarters and support company, which was the command and logistics of the battalion. The 3 different mechanized infantry companies were the maneuver elements that would attack this squadron, along with the same from this, as only one of the mechanized infantry companies of each battalion would sit back and guard the rear flanks of the fire support company and headquarters and logistical forces of the headquarters and support companies of each battalion, leaving 5 companies each of the mechanized infantry companies to attack this area, as 5 companies would attack the south and also fan out an attack from the east towards the west of this battalion. Approximately 2 would come up from the middle and 3 would come up against the side, as this squadron, 2nd Squadron, was made up of 3 combat companies or troops and a headquarters and support troop or company, and also its support company, its chief logistical element, although the headquarters had logistical assets as well, and the 1 armored company with the 2 rifle companies or troops, the mechanized infantry forces, as the 2nd Squadron was more of a mechanized infantry heavy force, although it did have armor in the form of its 1 heavy troop. virtually the entire attacking companies of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion of the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade coming in from the west towards the east would be attacking and holding up the armored company or tank company or heavy troop, if you will, while the other battalion would be more focused on the two mechanized infantry companies or troops, the rifle companies, rifle troops. As these forces moved in, they would receive heavy support from the PLZ-05 howitzers, the self-propelled 155mm guns of the firing batteries comprising the artillery battalion of the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, who would be firing not only at forces of the western-facing line of contact as this battalion attacked the armored forces, but would also be firing behind the line of contact in general, as this line of contact form a bucket or a U shape as these different companies attacked, and would be hitting the key logistical elements and command elements with the two companies that were seated essentially in their bivouac sites behind the suburban sprawl that was Missouri City, Texas, which contained the Trident factory, or the Trident Company Corporation, their factory, which manufactured parts that were critical to the power grid, as in utility poles and electronic components that went with the grid. Hence one reason why the Americans were deployed in this area and bivouacked in different locations, such as most frequently being empty lots that were leased from the property owners and utilized as different types of sites for the different comprising companies or troops that comprise this battalion or squadron in CAV terms, as these forces likely would have received orders to deploy to guard the very nearby Houston Southwest Airport. They would never receive these orders, as they would never be able to be passed down by the time the anti-satellite, cyber strike, and electronic warfare assets had been utilized against the forces in this area, with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strike affecting nationwide ISR and communications, with the local electronic warfare assets of the Chinese and Russians affecting the redundant communications in local areas like radios and also portable radars that were not dependent on satellite or internet and thus couldn't be hacked or couldn't be eliminated through the satellite strikes. Going to the two different segments of the larger battle, there was a 1 by 1 kilometer area segment of the south central portion of the line of contact, which contained the factory, the Trident factory here, as well as also a kilometer away up this very same street, this road, there was an area here which was another suburban area of also 1 by 1 kilometer, which contained a park with baseball diamonds, basketball court, had a drainage canal running behind this apartment complex, which was a luxury apartment complex with a swimming pool, leasing and rental office in the different apartment blocks and the pool house here, which were all destroyed by the artillery at the opening, hitting reactionary armed civilians, as well as also targeting the armor in an attempt to either damage the vehicles and disable them or to rattle the crew to the point where they would bail out and abandon the vehicles, if not outright destroy them were it possible. As this area contained a bank with the drive-through telling stations for the tellers, and the small business that was right here, as there was a street that ran up and connected to this street, and this street ran up this way in a more of a grid pattern, although this street came to a T intersection right here, beyond which there was a empty lot which contained a bivouac site that had been rented from the property owner in a thickly wooded lot wherein the tents had been pitched for the headquarters platoon of the tank company or heavy troop, as this was a gas station and another shop. And these were more upscale suburban type housing, as again, this city, Missouri City, was mostly a suburban sprawl. Although it did have a downtown area, it was a large inner suburban area of Houston, just to the slight southeast of the Sugarland area where these forces had detrained and had been moved by HET, or heavy equipment transporter trucks, to their bivouac sites, where they were unloaded at these parking lots and then had driven into their areas, but would shortly be on the move as PLA forces attacked, and fleeing armed refugees and armed reactionary civilians and unarmed refugees moved through the areas to and fro, back and forth, north-south, east-west, and so on, warning the local American forces they encountered of everything they've seen, as, again, there was no ISR network to speak of, and the communication systems were all completely down, leaving the military forces in the dark every bit as much as the civilian population, who had to find these things out largely on their own, and usually at their peril if they were armed and posed a threat to the Chinese forces and they deemed them a threat, they would eliminate them. As the ISR network of the coalition forces, primarily the Chinese and Russians especially, was out in full force, as the quadcopter local lower level recon assets that each and every single solitary squad and vehicle crew possessed, as well as the high altitude recon drones, either armed or unarmed, such as the armed CH-901A and the unarmed WZ-8 stealth drones, and even higher with the satellite level, created a map overlay of real-time battlefield data that was crunched by the AI processing system, which also connected to the combat data links, which steadily updated all troops and vehicles, as even the squads of infantry troops carried, and combat engineers and others carried, a PDA version of the combat data link for their troops to get updates on the battles as they developed, and all the relevant information, as the ISR assets constantly pinged where they saw enemy forces and updated them on the map as they existed and as they were destroyed. As all of these constellations of quadcopter drones, high-altitude drones, and satellites all worked in tandem to map the battlefield, as various other forms of data were calculated as well through the AI systems, such as all of the combat data relating to angle and traverse of weapons, the safety of weapons use as it pertained to friendly fire incidents, as it also calculated the capabilities of certain munition types and what they could do, and also influenced commanders on the field on where and when to fire, from the highest levels all the way down to the squad. As all of this was unfolding, the first moves in this area, as there were armed reactionary civilians in very small numbers in this section of the battle, as well as the other rest of the battle going on, as there was another rifle company, or essentially rifle troop or mechanized infantry troop, off the map and being fought by the other combat companies of mechanized infantry troops of the north attacking battalion coming from the south, whereas this was of a different battalion. There were two companies operating in this area, there were two to the north off map, and between these areas, in the 1 kilometer distance that separated these two areas through which this road ran, one entire company from the battalion attacking in this direction towards the east was moving behind these attacking forces and preparing to come up between this company's combat platoons, as the 3 combat platoons of this company were moving, where there was one off map moving to seize this road. They're moving this direction to make way for the other company to move straight ahead and link up with the others off map to the north that were moving in to lock in these American forces, so that if any somehow, some way survived, they would never be able to escape. While that was happening, the other battalion's combat troops were working closely in concert, as this was a company with others off map moving in this direction to the north and slightly east, to open a way in the diagonal sense, pressing open the American forces for the company to move up and link up with the other companies of the other battalion. As these two battalions worked together, as the armored forces were perceived as obviously the heaviest of the threats that were faced, as the PLA's mechanized infantry troops had a true tank-busting capability of their own in not only their dismounted troops that possessed the HJ-8 anti-tank missile, the 08, whereas the IFV, the infamous and very powerful and ultra-modern VN-20, had 2 on each vehicle of the HJ-12E newer anti-tank missile, and could utilize those to great effect and at a great distance to destroy enemy armored targets as their mechanized infantry dismounts fought through in their various tactical formations, such as this line formation with point man ahead and staggered rifles and light machine gun in the form of the QBJ-201, of there being a man that possessed one of those as well. And some of the troops even carried general purpose machine guns into battle, which were of the 7.62 by 54 millimeter size of the cartridge. As the fighting scenes in this particular area very much resembled those that were occurring with the PAP's battalions in the northwest of the city of the 36th PAP when they were assaulting the 3rd Squadron in this particular area of the city. The American tanks, as these were just the tanks and in this particular zone here, and not with any of the rifle company elements, as they were spread out and to the east, and all were facing this way to the south and also to the east, whereas directly behind the lines of contact, their lighter headquarters and command elements, as well as the other logistical forces, were present, as this YJ-18B submarine-launched cruise missile from a Song-class sub is heading directly to decapitate the command elements, along with the enormous artillery barrage coming in from the artillery battalion of the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade. As this company's forces move into battle, this house has been destroyed, and many homes that they have taken fire from had ample return fire meted out against them and were thus destroyed. As these forces immediately go in and begin to clear this building, as this rolling T formation moving up outside this multi-floor building is checking the windows as they go in. As per SOP, they stay outside the building while this one moves to this corner by the fence. And as this is happening, these three go in and begin to clear the main building of this factory, of the Trident factory, as this would be important to the CCP as well during this invasion, as this platoon of 5 vehicles stays back, with their troops also moving outside the main building as per SOP, and these two bounding and covering tactically as the shooting starts immediately, as the IFV, as it rolls forward, it has taken a tiny bit of small arms fire from these civilian technicals, which, as the vehicles move up, are destroyed immediately, as the heavy machine gun on the lead APC of this column of these 5 vehicles of the platoon, as one column of 3 moves this way, led by the VN-20, and another of 2 of the Type 89A APCs rolls up, firing their heavy machine guns at these 3 different technicals. These vehicles are immediately wiped out. As that's occurring, at the same time, this American platoon right here of their 4 vehicles, led by their Bradley and 3 M113s, are moving into place, with the Bradley moving up and all of them dropping off troops immediately while these vehicles are rolling up and shooting now at them, as the FLIR pod on the Bradleys is being scrambled and obscured by the IR scrambling technology aboard the VN-20. It also has laser scrambling, which affects the laser rangefinders of tanks and other weapons as well, is leading this column, which protects by proxy these 2 Type 89A APCs that are following behind. And also the armor aboard the VN-20 is very, very powerful, as it's very akin to tank armor, as well as also having a layer of added ERA plating or NERA plating, which is a pleak armor essentially that's non-explosive reactive. As these forces here bound and cover along with the vehicle's movements and then go in and take position in this home as the fighting starts, they now watch the flanks of this attack, watching this road from outside of this home, as all of these forces are exchanging fire, with the VN-20 opening fire and annihilating the Bradley as it moves up shortly after having had dropped off its forces, the Bradley being the first vehicle targeted. All the while, CH-901A loitering munitions are flying beyond and hitting the vehicles of the Americans, while the 120mm mortars and 130mm rockets from the fire support company, with the 130mm rockets flying over and off the map, are hitting much of these headquarters forces. This APC is coming from the headquarters company, having moved here as these forces made it to their starting positions at the opening of this map where it begins. The IFV, the VN-20, had fired one of its HJ-12Es and annihilates this vehicle shortly after it had fired its 30 autocannon and 100 millimeter and shredded this Bradley to smoking ruins as the vehicles had attempted to fire back, and although the civilians were in the way and the Americans tried to be cautious at first, when they saw these vehicles get blasted while these vehicles were firing from their initial starting points as they were moving, they then tried to lock on with their FLIR pod for their tow missile system, and it was scrambled, and they were unable to get a good bead on the VN-20, which broke off and went this way, and they dropped their troops off as well, as these troops had been dropped off, and they were at first behind their vehicle, but then they bounded alongside the Bradley, which was shredded up and annihilated, which KIA'd a few of these troops of the squad, although they were spread out. And then the rest of the fire coming from the VN-20 had finished them off as the troops dismounted from the APCs. And all the while, they're exchanging 12.7 millimeter fire with the American 50 cal fire, and the dismounts of each side were exchanging fire as well. As by the time these vehicles got here, they dismounted their troops into a rolling shield type formation on the sides of the vehicles, peering around corners when they could, or firing straight ahead as they came around from the backs of their vehicles as these American troops tried to get into tactical formations but had poor results as the heavy machine gun turrets of these vehicles, as well as even the heavy machine guns from the American vehicles, temporarily hitting a few PLA troops and wiping them out completely, blasting them nearly in half, while the PLA 12.7s, which were their version of a 50 cal weapon, had shredded up the Americans as well. And the fire exchange from the PLA troops with their RPG rounds from their Chinese Type 69 RPGs firing their anti-personnel rounds, as well as some firing anti-tank rounds, while the 12.7s light up the much more lightly armored M113s compared to the Type 89As, which are made of RHA steel, layers of it, thickness of it, whereas the VN-20 is even drastically more armored than even the APCs, along with also additional armor, which means that the AT-4s that hit it, from the few that were fired at it, did absolutely zero to it, nothing. And the vehicle fire return from the 30mm autocannon, shredding up these troops, just annihilated them where they stood, as all these loitering munitions and mortars were annihilating their vehicles of their headquarters platoon, which had set up in their bivouac site leased from the railroad, as this property here was owned by the railroad between these tracks. They had set up their tents just off map with their vehicles, their fueler, their 2 LMTVs. They had more LMTVs and other vehicles off map, half of their armored recovery vehicles here, as well as one of their M113 APCs, all of which are being hit by these heat warhead equipped CH-901As. This MRAP from the headquarters is over here. It gets destroyed by an anti-tank missile fired from the forces as they advanced down the street. The first opening move of the entire map was these armed reactionary civilians flying down the road. At first were ignored as the ISR assets didn't see any weapons in their hands, but when they drew their weapons and began to point them out their technical and began to fire, the 30mm autocannon just annihilated this vehicle in a small burst of a few rounds. It just blasted this vehicle into shrapnel that flew in all kinds of directions, with the engine block and the remaining of it just rolling off to the side of the road, as the heavy machine guns were lighting up these armed civilians in their technical, as they were all seen first by the ISR quadcopter assets. They knew where everything was, and thus were able to call in a mortar strike on this squad as they tried to move into this area, and a CH-901A came in and annihilated them to clear the flanks of this platoon, beginning to move to the area anticipated to cross this elevated road, as it was elevated as there needed to be a rail bridge right here over the rail system, which connected through the factory, as there was fencing here and gates that rolled open and closed for the rail. And there was the squad taking position inside this building, which was the receiving building with one of the concrete platforms outside for the factory to receive stuff through their supply lines. And as this squad was moving out from under, they were beginning to take fire from the vehicles as they had tried briefly to fire at them, and also at the troops now firing at them out the windows of this facility at the same time. And they were cut down rapidly while this squad peeling around and coming through beneath. These had all been dismounted from this platoon of vehicles right here. They had all dismounted and took their positions here with this squad in a wedge formation going around and getting in the prone position while they were already taking some fire, which was smacking into the elevated parts of the road here, and they took position behind it and returned fire with their small arms, firing a few 40mm grenades from their 203 man. But eventually the 12.7mm fire and some IFV fire with a 100mm round just blasted these guys and finished them all off. As these vehicles moved through and were firing over in this direction, they were shredding through this house. A lot of diagonal fire vectored this way as these men between these homes were laying in the prone position and were taking cover between the homes as they had some brick foundations, and some of that shielded them a little bit from shrapnel and other types of flying debris. But 12.7 could shred right through all that eventually as well. And also, the 100mm and 30mm, the bricks were no match for it. Just blasted this house all the way down to its foundations, and pieces of it flew in all directions as another 100mm round slammed into these troops right here on the other side of them. And the loitering munitions moving into the area, one at the opening hitting this Bradley for this platoon right here, as there's a 4th armor personnel carrier moving into this area about the time that these movements are occurring here, as these forces had by now annihilated these two squads with the heavy 12.7 fire, and they also got this squad as well, as this platoon of vehicles is now moving up toward the top of the bridge. And as these vehicles had shifted before that had happened, with their forces already dismounted, their Bradley was trying to fire at the time with their weaponry over here, but they couldn't do it because of the elevation, so they ended up instead trying to fire at this vehicle right here, which was an IFV that returned fire. This VN-20 right here had returned fire and destroyed the Bradley, while this M113 moved here and was also being shredded up, as the armor again was very weak. It was a aluminum alloy armor. It wasn't RHA steel like the Type 89As for the armor personnel carriers, although it made it light and easily to transport for equipment. You know, its drawback was its armor was not that effective and could be easily destroyed by heavy weapons, and this thing was shredded up and annihilated with all the crew that had bailed out of it, minus the gunner and driver who were still in it and had got KIA'd from it. As that was happening, there were combat medics in the area who were not targeted outright, as again, the PLA tried to follow Geneva Conventions, and because these had crosses on them that distinguished them as medics, they were left alone. As this one already had casualties and was beginning to leave the area, they did not go out of their way to destroy them, while this Loong 2 was firing 2 of its CM502 KGs off-map and hitting headquarters elements of the mechanized infantry troops that were trying to flee the area and get away, while the mortars and loitering munitions got the rest. The medics were generally left alone, as these medics were running into position, and they had already now gotten a few wounded troops out of this APC as it was hit by 12.7 fire, which ripped through part of it and actually injured a few of the troops, as the armor slowed down the rounds enough to where when they hit the body armor, they mostly caused some injuries that weren't too extreme, as the armor slowed the rounds down enough to where when they ripped through the armor, they got one guy in his upper shoulder area, and it was a massive hole, but the Kevlar plating had slowed it down, and the armor outside of it had as well, and they ran this guy out as he was bleeding profusely, loaded him up, and they got another guy out that had a nasty leg wound, and they loaded him up in this vehicle, and they pulled out. Again, the armor slowed the 12.7s down, but it killed some of the crew, and it wounded 2 others, so the rest, which was the crew members, as they had by then, at the opening, dismounted the rest of their squad, they now had been destroyed by all the rest of the 12.7mm fire levied against it, as these medics got out the casualties, including the KIA'd soldier that they had brought out, with the rest, the gunner and driver, now being KIA'd as the vehicle had shifted, along with the Bradley being destroyed. This APC had been destroyed not so much by the mortar, as the shrapnel from it caused some minor damage as it began to move, but mostly from the fire now bearing down on it from the vehicles that were now beginning to cross, as well as the crossfire coming from this direction as well, which annihilated these vehicles, as the mortar had gotten two of this squad. Even the heat-laden warhead of this got the rest of that squad there that was in the wedge formation at the bottom of this, which cleared the way for these vehicles to continue moving. But these forces over here, as so much was going on at the same time, this forward logistical station set up as a forward aid station and forward logistical point by the support company or troop of the entire squadron. They'd set this up. It had a gravel driveway coming into it. It was leased from behind this shopping center in these homes as an empty lot that had woods in it, and it was hit directly and around it, around the razor wire fencing, the concertina wire that was set up, and the tiny grouping of quartermaster and medic troops got KIA'd as a result of being there. Although they weren't targeted deliberately, the fact that this was a forward supply and medical station made it a target mostly because it was a supply station and not for the other reason. As these forces moved into place here, this APC, as this was the Bradley, it got destroyed at the beginning. These two were combat medics running to help the men here as they were being shredded up, but they had all been KIA'd, including the combat medics for running into the path of fire, as this house was horribly gutted and shredded up from 12.7 millimeter fire. This one had been outright destroyed by a 100 millimeter shell and 30 millimeter HE autocannon shells. And as that was occurring, these vehicles, including this IFV coming up here, making the choice by the time we reach the end of the garage to just ram right through the garage, which is why the garage is surrounded by red, but not the rest of this large house. They just smashed through the garage as it was in their way, and they drove around here after these forces had come around, as this APC was now beginning to move here, but it was being fired at along with the rest of the surviving troops that were still here trying to fight, as this APC had moved here originally, and then as it moved around, the fire coming from this way, and this way after this one had been destroyed annihilated this last APC. As mortar damage had already occurred as well, the vehicle was still combat worthy and had tried to fight as it moved out of the area as the mortar struck right down here, and the other mortars landed directly in it. But the icon can't be seen as it's difficult to overlay. But as that happened, the only real survivors were the combat medics that were not directly targeted and were allowed and permitted to flee the area, even though off-map 130mm rockets, additional mortar strikes from 120mm mortars, and 155mm shell strikes were ravaging the downtown area, where in a downtown parking area, the headquarters company or troop had actually set up tents, and then that was also hit directly by a cruise missile strike from one of the Song-class subs, a YJ-18B strike. As the combat had unfolded inside the factory, as this squad actually did, they were the only forces that actually made it to one of their objectives where they were supposed to be defending, as the forces were based so close but yet were so far away, because when the PLA showed up in the area, they had no chance to get into this area except for the dismounts, who barely made it in with their lives as these forces were firing at them. Even the vehicles were trying to fire over the rails as they had annihilated these troops by the rails. 12.7mm fire briefly went over this way, and it injured a few of the troops, but they had gotten in, not from the 12.7 fire, but from the small arms fire. They'd been injured. The 12.7 barely missed them. And as they got in here, they were now in a battle, in a firefight inside this massive factory with these three different squads, as there was another squad that went in here and had engaged these troops earlier when they moved up here. As these troops had also moved in about the same time as this was going on, and had also been mildly engaged by the 12.7, which was mostly vectored at these troops coming under this way. They made it in barely with their lives, but they all ended up being KIA'd or captured as they entered this facility. They lost 4 troops, and they had 6 of them surrender, and all 6 of them were injured out of the 10-man squad that went in there. As this battle had concluded up here, as these different dismounted squads and vehicles all exchanged fire with one another, with the Bradley the first to be taken out, and then these troops that came out of it. These squads were able to bound one more time tactically with each other, trying to close within grenade range of these troops and vehicles, but they just cut them all down as they were bounding through a patchy area of different wooded terrain, as this was a thick wooded area here and here and here. There was woods in here that they were trying to to take cover within, but they could all be seen by the IR and night vision optics of the gunners on the turrets, as well as also the vehicle sensors in the VN-20, and all of the quadcopter assets monitoring their every location. There were some PLA troops that were KIA'd in this back and forth attack, but the Americans had all been completely KIA'd. And as the Tu-22M was passing over the area, it was moving on to strategically level another portion of the city, as artillery just off map, merely 500 meters off the map, was smashing the outer areas of downtown and the inner areas, along with this cruise missile strike that went further off the map and was rapidly hitting the parking lot where the headquarters troops were, where they had set up their bivouac site, their tents, at a rented out, leased out parking area, public parking area. As all of this fighting, as this had been destroyed, this forward supply area and this lot that had been leased, as all of this was going on literally at the same exact time as this map over here was going on, this company moving into this area, by the time the other platoons are moving up the street, they were getting ready to peel off and take their objectives. As this platoon on the very end, these two APCs, this VN-20, and the two other APCs of this platoon on the very end had seized control of the road by the time they had finished off these American forces and the mortar strikes had destroyed the forward supply and medical point, as the fighting in the woods would have very closely resembled what these American troops were going through when the vehicles had dismounted them into the wooded areas and the PLA troops dismounted and pursued them. The last several troops in this area were vigorously wiped out by the combo of vehicle and ground-based personnel fire, in addition to the ground-based vehicle fire, while the loitering munitions, mortars, and even off-map rockets of the 130mm variety smashed the headquarters forces, with also strikes from the missile strikes coming from the Wing Loong 2. There were two Wing Loong 2s operating in this area, as there were armored vehicles to contend with. And in this particular area, although the VN-20s were savage tank-killing vehicles, as they had their anti-tank missiles, or HJ-12Es, they also had their 100mm main gun, 30 autocannon, 7.62x54 coax, and all their capabilities of laser and IR scrambling, and other capabilities as well, their optics and their sensors and everything else they possessed. These mechanized infantry forces were definitely a force to be reckoned with, especially with the enormous loitering munition support they received from the headquarters battalion of their own headquarters battalion from the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, which had their dedicated drone sections fire in support of the armored battalions attacking our two artillery battalions and the two mechanized infantry battalions attacking 2nd Squadron. Out of the 48 total loitering munitions fired, 10 came into this 1 by 1 kilometer area. A kilometer away, 16 were in this area, and off the map, the remaining 22 were in that area as well, dealing with the other rifle company or troop, with the other companies supporting them. The two Wing Loong 2s in this area and one in this area were accompanied by a fourth fighting against the other rifle company as well. This fighter jet, this J-10, is just passing over doing a routine combat air patrol over the battlefield and are not called in to provide any type of support. As armed reactionary civilians, again, are transiting through the area, they eventually end up having to fight the attackers because they have no other option, as the combat raging in this area over here by the bank is heated as these vehicles had moved into position. This APC on the end has taken fire from these personnel, but they return fire with the machine guns, and even before the IFV can move in and destroy them, the machine guns have already done the job, the 12.7mm, and they shredded into the bank building and everything. At the opening of the battle, these armed civilians have been KIA'd in these artillery strikes along the road, which also destroy these two middle LMTV trucks, which are supply trucks coming from the supply forces of the supply troop, the support troop rather. They're moving down this road, as in by the time the entire battle opens up, they've already passed through this area and are now entering the road here, and are about to supply these troops by going through the clearing, passing the gas station parking lot through the clearing and into their wooded bivouac location. But instead, as the artillery falls and destroys these supply vehicles, there's an enormous blast from the tank shells and ammunition, as well as the food and fuel and water all go up completely in flames, as this vehicle is horribly damaged but makes it around with this other vehicle. And as both get here, they all end up departing their vehicles. They leave their vehicles for now because they want to go and hide in the woods and wait to see if any artillery hits. But by the time they even get out to do that, it's already too late, and they've been annihilated by 4 different 155 strikes that come down and get them and their trucks anyhow, which also erupt into flames and a fiery blast and a miniature mushroom cloud as a result of the ammunition going up. And as that's going on, by the swimming pool area, these personnel running through this drainage ditch, after they crawl through these culverts underneath the road, they've been running through this ditch trying to keep a low profile, which was an intelligent idea, but by that time this dismounted squad from the APC here has moved here, and they end up getting in an engagement while they continue to run, but eventually they're all cut down. And as this vehicle has been hit at the very opening by this American tank firing at it and destroying it, this other APC that this squad had gotten out of, another Chinese APC is destroyed on the very end of this inverted wedge formation right here, where this Loong 2 is firing its CM502 KGs, destroying this tank at the opening of the map, as well as this tank, which gets hit by a missile from this drone, this CM502 KG. Both hit this tank at exactly the same time, while this tank's also hit and destroyed, as this one was able to fire at and destroy a PLA vehicle, as well as then, by the time it gets here, it was able to likewise fire at and destroy this one, as it was able to see them through their optics. They could fire at least what they could see, and what wouldn't scramble their laser range-finding device that they required to laze targets for accuracy. As loitering munitions had also come in, they too were seeking targets, and this one, although it had a heat warhead, hit this grouping of armed reactionary civilians along with a direct mortar strike here, and a mortar strike right here. The icon has to be placed outside, but it landed immediately in the drainage ditch, as although they were doing well at first, keeping a low profile, the ISR assets, when spotting them, had radioed in the precise coordinates of the actual ditch and landed a mortar right in it. As this grouping was running away at the opening of this map, between this walkway right here that connected these baseball diamonds and the basketball court in this wooded park, they're running through the area trying to get to the drainage ditch, but all of the heavy machine gun fire cuts them down, along with a single IFV 100mm shell by the time they get here with the 12.7 fire. It just shreds them all up into hunks of meat between the 12.7s and the 100mm. As this tank moved here after firing it and destroying these two different vehicles, this tank itself gets destroyed when an HJ-08 gets fired by this squad as it moves into position, bounding and covering with this squad that dismounted and moved here, as this tank was dangerous and had to be eliminated quickly. As this tank had been destroyed at the opening by an IFV-fired missile coming from the VN-20 firing its HJ-12E at this tank and destroying it. As this tank moves, its machine guns are blazing while these two different squads are bounding and covering tactically. This one first laying down by this hill as the machine gun rounds are impacting. As scenes, again, similar to this would have been occurring as the Loong 2 firing CM502 KGs or HJ-10s, as it could be equipped with both, as well as even certain dropped munitions that were very destructive against armor. And these 50 cal and 240 Bravo gunners on the tank were opening fire, as well as there being a coax machine gun with the main tank gun that could fire alongside of it. And as these vehicles were moving through yet another suburban neighborhood in the same way, minus the addition of the armored personnel carriers and Bradleys, these tanks were being engaged by air-fired weapons, whether they were the CM502 KGs or whether they were the CH-901A loitering munitions, they were being torn apart at this point as these different weapons struck their targets, as these tanks of this other platoon right here were moving out of the area as the combat had begun. And as these forces had already been warned of what was going on by passing civilians, this loitering munition, this one and this one, come in and destroy this tank, and this tank right here. They destroy this tent right here, and this other tent right here, while artillery then flies in and decimates everything, including even this armored ambulance vehicle right here that gets destroyed when all the artillery strikes this headquarters platoon area. But by that point, these tanks have already moved, as they're now fully aware that there's enemy forces in the area, and at which point these CM502KGs, as early on these tanks had moved here and here, were decimated by these missiles, while this command tank from the headquarters platoon had already moved as well, moving into position here. And this is after these vehicles have been decimated, and this tank moved here briefly before moving again to try to see what was even going on in this area, as artillery had destroyed these upscale houses right here. Mortar fire had landed and cut down these armed reactionary civilians attempting to flee down the street, and missiles had destroyed these tanks, along with this tank about to be hit by a loitering munition strike, as the loitering munitions coming into the area were about to come in and get it as well, as it moved into this gas station parking lot. And the other loitering munition was about to hit this command tank moving into the area there. As that was happening, the rest of the tanks of the platoon that moved out, this was one of the command tanks that got destroyed, whereas the other one actually got out of the area. It was right up here, operating in this area here. It was moving into this area near this drainage ditch that basically ran parallel to this street, went under the gas station property and the store property right here. Their parking lots and emptied out right here where this culvert is. There are those little drainage grates every so many feet. And as the Loong 2 fired and destroyed their different targets, this tank, and the apartment complex was being decimated with these armed reactionary civilians that were running through the apartment complex with their weapons getting hit in this strike and KIA'd immediately, along with many people that were even innocent in these buildings, just to destroy the armed combatants. As that happened, these buildings were temporarily left intact as this loitering munition came in and killed this tank by the time it got here, although its machine guns were starting to go off against this APC, while the IFV also opened fire against it as well, but with its 100mm gun, which didn't destroy the tank but damaged it slightly, and this CH-901A finished it off along with this one, killing this tank. As this squad was dismounted off map, moving in this area here, while this squad bounded and covered tactically with it around this house, this wedge formation. By the time it got to the garage, this other squad bounded into the ditch and then bounded out of it against this house, while this squad bounded in the ditch and took position to watch the house while they went around, as they didn't see any enemy activity in the house, anyone going into and in it, so they held their position here. While this half squad and this half squad that had earlier taken fire from the tanks and took cover behind the ditch, or behind the mound here, and they laid in the prone, now bounded and covered until they got in the ditch and took position in the ditch to watch into the apartment complex tactically, while this squad then bounded into this house, kicking in its back door and going inside of it. And as this tank had made it into this area right here, they fired an HJ-08 missile out of it just as they were opening fire with their crew serves, both their crew serves and their coax, which ended up eliminating some of the PLA troops that were in the house. As all of that was occurring, the artillery that had come in and decimated the rest of the headquarters platoon at their bivouac site, along with the tents, with the combo of loitering munition strikes on the tents and tank right here, this command tank, had ended up to where the final operation of this was this platoon here, this combat platoon, with the headquarters platoon off map, of course, with the other platoon moving into this area right here by the street as the artillery had ceased and these houses were thoroughly destroyed. They moved in here, and the last platoon moved in about here and seized control of this road that went off the map. They took this part, and the other full company went up and wrapped around this area where they met up with the two other companies off map from this attacking battalion here. This mechanized infantry battalion had two companies to the north that were coming around. They had two companies in the center, They have one company coming up and one that sat in the back to protect their fire support company and their headquarters company of their battalion, just like was done with this battalion as well, moving up from the center and hooking around, fanning out and going around and attacking from the east towards the west and also from the south. They did the same thing. They each had a single mechanized infantry company defending their fire support company and of course their headquarters company, which was their logistical and command elements, as the mechanized infantry troops moved in their various tactical formations, making them very formidable as they provided themselves full 360-degree security everywhere they moved, as their heavy vehicles provided them excellent and dynamic fire support with a multiple array of different weaponry, as well as also support from loitering munitions and also weapons-equipped combat drones like the Loong 2s that orbited the area seeking out targets with their very powerful CM502 KGs. Even sea-fired cruise missiles, along with the enormous barrage of artillery flying off map and decimating the city proper within which the actual headquarters and logistical forces were actually in. The city was essentially a pockmarked, rubble-strewn, basically moonscape, as was parts of the suburban areas where the heaviest of the fighting had occurred, which included this area here, which was a vehicle graveyard with some destroyed homes in it, which included this home here that armed civilians had tried to fire out of as these forces approached the area to begin with. And some of the combat occurring off-map was between the other rifle company, a bit further away, no more than 500 meters away, with the rest of the PLA mechanized infantry companies, which were 3 total from this battalion that had swung around and attacked from that direction. As the final move in this map was this platoon moving up the road and breaking their vehicles up in a herringbone formation where the IFV faced ahead, and these vehicles moved in this herringbone formation, faced this way and this way to watch the sides towards the front, and the IFV, the most powerful vehicle, watching the front of their platoon as their last move. As the mortars had destroyed everything and the road had been seized coming from this direction, so the entire company moving up between this area and this area of belonging to the same battalion that these two companies belonged to, this full company of this platoon, and one platoon taking the road just off the map. And that other company was moving up to link up with the two companies moving north, as they were to box in this entire area wherein the original American forces were, the original armored forces, the heavy company, the heavy troop, as these Chinese forces had basically decimated all the armed civilians they found within this 1 by 1 kilometer area with heavy artillery strikes, with mortar strikes, and also with small arms fire and heavy machine gun fire, included what occurred at this bank where this drive-through, where the tellers are. They were at the edge of the parking lot, laying by the curb, laying down small arms fire against this vehicle, which returned fire promptly along with this vehicle, and they just smoked these guys, whereas the artillery decimated these personnel. And these personnel by this apartment block, they got completely shelled with a lot of innocent people in it, but the reason for shelling it was because there was armed civilian activity, so they just destroyed it. Again, they bent the Geneva Conventions, but they never outright broke them. But they were apparently within their right to shell it, as it was seen as a hostile location. So these forces moved up, seized this road from this way. On the other side, this platoon, 3 vehicles of it, seized this part of the road from this direction. This forward logistical station was thoroughly smashed and destroyed. This bomber continued on to hit its target it was headed towards. Cruise missiles struck downtown and hit the parking lot wherein the headquarters tents were set up. And all the artillery fire did the rest, demolishing the rest of the headquarters troop or company and the remains of the logistical and support troops, although they didn't directly target the combat medics that they allowed to flee the area. If they were crazy enough to drive in to their location, their main location with the headquarters troop, with the rest of their support troop, it would have essentially meant the end of themselves because that area was being heavily shelled. So they opted to instead pause and wait for the shelling to cease before they moved in to check the ruins to see if anybody was even still alive, but by which point the PLA was about to take them prisoner as their forces were about to continue sweeping the area in a broad sweep as they gradually encircled this area relatively quickly once these platoons had moved in and secured the road from this way. This platoon secured the road from this way of this other separate company, and one full company went up and linked up with the other two companies as their flanks of their advance were covered from both sides, and they were able to do so in between these maps. So essentially, the maps were again a kilometer apart. Combat with the other rifle company was 500 meters apart, or half a kilometer away, with the other three PLA companies coming around and dealing with them over here. This was a large battle. It covered several miles in total length, from the very end over here to the very end of where the fighting was going on, as that was another kilometer by kilometer area with 500 meters here and another kilometer here. Yeah, it was about several miles in total length. And in depth, it was again about 2 miles in depth, because the downtown area off the map, even further north near Route 8, which Route 8 went through here, the ring road, with which the Hets had come from the Sugarland area and moved into the area to drop off their heavy equipment like the tanks and all their associated vehicles, including the Bradleys and the APCs, the M113s and the other vehicles as well that were not wheeled vehicles were brought in by Het, and they were dropped off at the bivouac sites and locations of the American forces in the local area. Again, originally, their objective was to defend this plant, and although they had troops end up going in and trying to fight over it with these squads in here, and they got into a large, drawn-out firefight, they had ultimately failed in their objective, and the PLA continued to drive on, and this battle lasted an hour, from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. In the next video, in the Battle of Houston, the fighting that was going on between the People's Armed Police and the rest of the forces of the American reactionary type that were in the Northwest, as these two battalions cleared the flank of the American reactionary armed civilians and especially the 3rd Squadron to the south of 249, allowing for their other battalion finishing up here to move deep into the city and conduct their operations. These two battalions were moving through a thickly wooded residential area, more upscale, and they were clearing armed reactionary civilians who appeared there and tried to challenge them. This will be gone over in the next video of the hypothetical invasion documentary series Battle of Houston, using 4th generation warfare doctrines.